Case of Michelle Missy. In the quiet suburbs of Southern California, the disappearance and tragic death of Michelle Yvette Missy Avila deeply shook a close-knit community. Her story is one of friendship, betrayal, and a devastating loss that left an indelible mark on those who knew her. The vanishing of Missy Avila caused shockwaves in the community, as friends, family, and law enforcement mobilized in a desperate search to find her. The quest to uncover the truth behind her disappearance would reveal a disturbing tale of betrayal among those she trusted. Missy was known for her bright smile and caring nature, a young woman with dreams of a promising future. As the details surrounding her disappearance emerged, the heartbreaking story of friendships turned sinister captivated the nation's attention. This is the story of Michelle Yvette Missy Avila, her whose life was tragically cut short. Missy was born on February 8, 1968 and grew up in our later Los Angeles. She lived with her mother and 3 brothers and attended San Fernando High School with her 2 best friends, Karen Severson and Laura Doyle. Missy and Karen had been best friends since they were 8 years old, but the girls started to drift apart once they entered high school. Missy was very beautiful and had very long hair, which she loved, and she was quite popular and well-liked by most of her peers. Karen and Laura began to feel envious of the attention Missy received from others, especially from boys. During Missy's sophomore year of high school, a rumor began to spread that claimed Missy had been engaging in sexual relationships with several boys, all of whom had girlfriends. This rumor prompted a group of girls to confront Missy outside of school and assault her severely. As soon as Missy got home, her parents pressed charges against the ringleader of the attack, Sonia Bond. Missy was expected to appear in court on October 8, 1985 to testify against Sonia, but she would sadly never get that opportunity. Earlier in September, Missy had a falling out with both Karen and Laura due to the same rumor that had been spread a year earlier, in which Missy was accused of having sexual relationships with her friends' boyfriends. This time, the 2 girls involved were her best friends, Karen and Laura. Missy began dating a boy named Randy earlier in their junior year, but their relationship only lasted around a month before Missy broke things off, as she couldn't stand his constant partying. Not long after, Karen and Randy started dating and moved in together. However, Randy still had feelings for Missy, and Karen saw him flirting with her. Missy turned Randy down and told him she wasn't interested in rekindling their relationship. Missy also tried to be a good friend by telling Karen she should consider ending the relationship with Randy and try to find a better boyfriend. This angered Karen, and she and Laura spread rumors again and decided to confront Missy at one of the parks in their neighborhood. Missy tried pleading with them, telling them she would never betray either of them like that, and that these were the same rumors that were spread the year prior. Eyewitnesses claimed that Karen was seen shouting at Missy, threatening her with a broken beer bottle, pushing her to the ground, and slapping her before she and Laura stormed off. This incident occurred 10 days before Missy's murder. Not long after that incident, Laura expressed regret and contacted Missy, and the 2 of them decided to put everything behind them and continue with their friendship. However, Karen was still avoiding Missy until October 1st, when she contacted Missy and sincerely apologized to her about everything that had escalated between them. This meant a lot to Missy, as she had started to miss her friends, and the trio made plans to hang out at Stonehurst Park later that same day. On October 1st, 1985, Missy told her mom that she made plans to hang out with her friends and her mom gave her permission to go, but she had to be back home by 6 p.m. Missy went outside and waited for Laura to pick her up. After Laura picked her up, the girls drove around for a while before making their way to Stonehurst Park, where they parked the car and waited for Karen to show up. A few minutes passed and Karen pulled into the parking lot with their other friend, Eva, in the passenger seat. That's when things took a turn for the worse for Missy. When Karen entered the parking lot, she parked extremely close to Laura's car, rolled down her window and began yelling at Laura. Laura also rolled down her window and started yelling back at Karen. Missy and Eva just sat there, shocked, watching their friends shout abusive things at each other. Missy had no idea what they were arguing about. Suddenly, Karen backed up and sped out of the parking lot, and Laura followed her for 45 minutes. They drove recklessly north of the city and into the mountains, both girls driving with such extreme anger that Missy and Eva were begging the girls to calm down and pull the cars over. The girls drove right into a parking lot that led to a huge forest. Laura and Karen got out of their cars, confronted each other, and continued to fight. Missy got out of the car in an attempt to stop her friends from fighting. However, as soon as she left the car, Karen and Laura suddenly ceased their argument, turned their attention to Missy, and approached her aggressively. They got so close to Missy that she was unable to re-enter the car or move away from it. Karen then laughed at Missy and informed her that they were not actually fighting and had no animosity towards each other, but rather they were angry with Missy. They revealed that the entire situation was a ploy to lure Missy into the woods so that they could confront her and teach her a lesson. They then shouted at Missy and explained that they had spread the rumors because they knew for a fact that she had slept with their boyfriends and they were not going to let her get away with it. Missy tried pleading with them, telling them again that she would never do anything like that she never slept with anyone, but they wouldn't listen. When Missy started to shut down, the girls grabbed her and pushed her away from the car and towards a trail that led into the forest. Given that Missy was quite petite compared to the other girls, being only 4 feet 10 and 95 pounds, while Karen was 5 feet 2 and over 200 pounds, and Laura was 5 feet 6 and 135 pounds, Missy was unable to defend herself against the constant pushes by the two girls as they forced her to walk further down the trail. Eva was in the car during the entire altercation. She finally got out of the car and started walking behind the group. Eva was not involved in anything the girls did in the forest, and she didn't even know why she was brought along in the first place. When the group was out of view from the parking lot and deep into the forest, Laura stopped and faced Missy, who was crying helplessly and scared, and punched her right in the face. As soon as Laura started punching her, Karen joined in, and within seconds, Missy was on the ground, being beaten, punched, and stomped on. When they stopped, Laura pulled out a knife, grabbed Missy by the hair, and started cutting off chunks of her hair. They did this intentionally because they knew how much Missy loved her beautiful long hair. Karen wanted to join in on the hair cutting, but since she didn't have a knife, she just started pulling out chunks with her hands, while Eva stood there watching it all happen. After they had finished that activity, they produced restraints, bound Missy's arms behind her back, and gagged her. Since there was a river around 10 feet away from their location, Laura walked into the stream, looked directly at Missy, began running her hands through the water, gave Missy a smirk, and started taunting her, asking her to come into the water with her. When Missy did not move, Karen seized her, forcefully stood her up and shoved her towards the river, causing her to fall down the hill. Since her arms were restrained behind her back, her face slammed down onto the ground, and she rolled up to the river. Laura and Karen then grabbed her and dragged her into the water. That's when Eva hastily ran back up the trail to the cars. Upon arriving at the cars, Eva realized that both vehicles were locked and too far to fetch assistance. She reluctantly started walking back down the trail until she heard a terrifying scream. She stopped, turned around, and swiftly ran back to the cars, where she lay on the ground in a fetal position and waited for approximately an hour for the girls to return. Eventually, she saw Laura and Karen, who were dripping wet and smiling and laughing. But Missy was not with them. Laura and Karen were holding Missy's body in the water that was 8 inches deep. The scream that Eva heard happened when Missy was briefly able to get her head above the water. But then Karen grabbed her head and pushed it back into the water. When the girls realized that Missy was near death, they released her, ran to a large log and dropped it on her head. The girls then left the forest, got into their cars with Eva, and went home. For hours later, Laura called Missy's mother, Irene Avila, claiming that she had dropped Missy off with 3 boys driving a blue Camaro after getting gas. Laura said she returned to the location, but Missy and the boys had already left. On October 4th, 1985, Missy's body was found face down in a stream in Big Two Hanger Canyon in Angeles National Forest, 3 days later by a group of hikers. Police found that she had been forcibly drowned in 8 inches of water and her waist-length hair had been cut off. A 4-foot log was found on top of her body and cigarettes. Beer and men's overalls were found near where her body was discovered. The girls told Missy's parents and the detectives that Missy had gone off with 2 men in a blue Camaro before she disappeared, which made the random items around the crime scene seem more plausible. This false claim sent the detectives on a fruitless investigation for the non-existent men for 3 years. Irene later said she had no reason to suspect Karen or Laura were involved in her daughter's death because both of them attended Missy's funeral and Laura sent the family a sympathy card with $20. Karen also moved in with Missy's family for a long time, outwardly showing support and trying to help catch the killers, all while closely monitoring the investigation and attempting to divert the investigators from her own involvement. Karen was intensely focused on the murder, frequently visiting Missy's grave, covering the walls of her room with pictures of Missy and newspaper articles about the crime, and repeatedly returning to the creek where Missy's body was discovered. At one point, she even told Irene that she had seen Missy's ghost. After 3 years, on July 26, 1988, Eva Chirumbolo, the other teenager who had taken the 45-minute drive into the mountains, finally came forward and told the police everything that had happened. She explained the rumors, the falling out, the anger, and the jealousy, as well as the details of the murder. Eva said she took so long to come forward because the other two girls had threatened to kill her if she ever revealed what she had seen. In March 1990, Karen and Laura were convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to 15 years to life in prison. The jurors were not convinced that the murder was planned, and they rejected the first-degree murder charge. Karen Severson was released from prison on December 9, 2011, after serving 21.5 years, and Laura Doyle was released from prison in December 2012, after serving 22 years. Karen Severson attempted to profit from her crime by writing a memoir about the murder and her prison life, but the book did not do well. She also made a deal for a movie to be made about it, but Avila's family sued her in 2015, seeking to take the profits from the sales. As a result, the state of California passed Missy's law, requiring entities who are helping publish works made by criminals to contact the families of the victims about the said works. Missy's story has sparked conversations about the impact of bullying, the complexities of teenage relationships, and the importance of fostering a culture of empathy and kindness. Community initiatives and support networks have emerged to provide resources and support for those affected by similar experiences. As we remember Missy, we honor her memory by working to create a world where friendships are built on trust and compassion. Her legacy serves as a reminder that every individual deserves respect, kindness, and the opportunity to live a life free from harm. In the end, Michelle Yvette Missy Avila's legacy will be one of resilience and hope. May her memory inspire us all to stand up against bullying, support those affected by betrayal, and work towards a future where understanding and empathy prevail. August 9, 1980, high school sweethearts Tim Hack and Kelly Drew, both 19, disappeared after attending a wedding reception at Concord House, Concord, Wisconsin. Within the next few days, searchers found some clues about the couple's whereabouts scattered across town in Concord. A pair of pants, Tim's car with his wallet inside, some ropes, and a pair of women's underwear. These clues led to a grisly discovery. 2 months later, the bodies of Tim and Kelly were found savagely violated and left to rot in a field. Almost 3 decades later, advancements in DNA technology, coupled with an unlikely witness and an investigator's relentless search for truth, led to the identification of the perpetrator. A man so unassuming, even his neighbors had no idea he harbored such dark secrets. But who was this man? And why did it take so long to find him? Today's story takes us back to Concord, Wisconsin, a small town in Jefferson County, Wisconsin. With a population just over 2,000, the quiet town has many parks and nature spots, making it an excellent place for people who love the outdoors. So activities like hiking, biking, fishing, and camping are common among the locals. Concord has a violent crime rate about 7%, about a third of the U.S. average of 22.7%. In the 1980s, when the main events in today's story occur, Concord was the sort of place where people never locked their doors and neighbors looked out for each other. So, it was just the sort of place where 19-year-old high school sweethearts, Tim Hack and Kelly Drew, believed they could get married, settle on a farm, raise their children, and grow old together. In 1980, Tim Hack and Kelly Drew were 19-year-old high school sweethearts, engaged to be married. Although Tim lived with his family in Hebron, a small town in Jefferson County, and Kelly lived with her family in Fort Atkinson, also in Jefferson County, the couple first met when attending Fort Atkinson High School. Kelly was a beautiful, kind young woman with a passion for cosmetology. Tim was a strong and hardworking farm boy. They were both loved by their friends and family for their kind-hearted natures. But as a couple, Tim and Kelly were seen as people for other youngsters to aspire to be like. After high school, Tim started his career as a farmer, and his best friend was a tractor nicknamed the Lonesome Loser. Meanwhile, Kelly went to beauty school and had just graduated in 1980, hoping to become a hairstylist and beautician. On August 9, 1980, Tim and Kelly attended a wedding reception at Concord House, Wisconsin. The couple had plans to meet some friends and go to a carnival after the reception, but they never showed up. The last time anyone saw them alive was around 11 p.m. on August 9, 1980, when they left the reception. By the morning of the following day, August 10, 1980, when they still hadn't been seen or heard from, Tim's father, David Hack, filed missing person reports for both of them. That same day, David found Tim's brown Oldsmobile in the Concord House's parking lot. Locked inside the car was Tim's wallet containing $67, his jacket, and his checkbook. On August 15th, searchers found Kelly's pants and underwear by the roadside, about 3 miles from Concord House, with male bodily fluids on them. They also found some ropes by the roadside that had been knotted by someone who appeared to have military experience. The discovery of these articles of clothing shifted the case drastically. Suddenly, it was no longer a matter of finding a couple who might have just decided to take off and have a romantic getaway. It was now a matter of trying to find them alive because they were likely in danger. About 2 months later, some squirrel hunters from Milwaukee were out in the Izone, Wisconsin area, 7 miles from the Concord House. While walking through a wooded area along a railroad track parallel to Highway 16 east of Watertown, they found the badly decomposed remains of Kelly Drew. She was completely naked. About 100 yards away, they found a fully clothed male body that was identified as the body of Tim Hack. The case, now officially a homicide, was dubbed the Sweetheart Murders. The cause of death was not immediately apparent because investigators found no murder weapon at the scene. However, upon examination, the medical examiner found stab wounds on Tim's body and ligature marks on Kelly. The bodily fluids found on Kelly's clothes also suggested assault. The Sweetheart Murders had all the elements of a sensational story, so it started making headlines across the country. 2 teenage sweethearts appeared to have been murdered in a senseless act of violence, and police could not identify the killer or killers. Their investigation began while interviewing everyone who knew the couple, to find out if anyone might have hated them enough to kill them. Police also interviewed everyone who attended the wedding reception, including the Concord House staff who worked there that night. One of the questioned workers was Edward Wayne Edwards, a handyman working at the Concord House. Edward, who lived in a campground adjacent to the Concord House near Interstate 94, claimed that he had not seen the couple and that he was not even at the Concord House around the time the couple went missing. He claimed that he was deer hunting in the nearby woods. However, police noticed that he had a broken nose. When they asked him about it, he claimed he had gotten it during his deer hunting trip. It seemed weird to the investigators because this was August and deer hunting season in Wisconsin was around November. After the police questioned him, Edward moved his wife and his 5 children away from Wisconsin in September 1980. Meanwhile, the most promising lead investigators had were eyewitness accounts of a dirty-looking van that had been parked next to Tim's car in the Concord House parking lot. Witnesses claimed that they noticed the van suddenly driving away suspiciously around the time Tim and Kelly were last seen. Edward had a van that fit that description, where he often kept a .357 revolver. But without a plate number or strong evidence connecting him to the crime scene, police could do very little to follow up on that lead. And like that, all other leads in the investigation dried up. The case file was shelved and the case went cold. In 2028, 20 years after the murders of Tim Hack and Kelly Drew, Richard Lewell from the Wisconsin Department of Justice, one of the investigators in charge of the original investigation, asked for the case to be reopened. For almost 30 years, Lewell had been unable to let go of the case. For almost 30 years, Lewell had been unable to let go of the case. And now that he was close to retirement, he wanted to do everything in his power to close the case. In an interview, he said, "As I was reaching my retirement age, DNA was making drastic leaps and bounds. He felt more confident pursuing the case now because of technological and scientific advancements of the last couple of decades. His newfound confidence was reflected in how he approached the case with vigor." Lewell had a hunch that the police had already interviewed the killer in the earlier stages of the investigation and that the person's name would be on file. He just had to find it. After 2 months of digging through the files, witness statements, and interview recordings, one name stood out to Lewell. Edward Wayne Edwards. Not only did Edward have the opportunity and means to commit the crimes, but the fact that he moved his entire family out of Wisconsin shortly after police interviewed him raised red flags. Llewellyn and a team of cold case investigators decided to follow up on his hunch that Edward was the potential killer. When they interviewed Edward's neighbors from when he lived in Concord, Wisconsin, they learned that Edward had been a very difficult person to live with. He was short-tempered and volatile, a restless man who often beat his wife and children on a whim. They said he was basically a monster. His son John Edwards, who is now 37 years old in 2008, described him as a troubled man, saying, "I don't think he knew how to control his emotions. There was some type of rage there." In 2009, April Bellagio, Edward's daughter, contacted authorities with disturbing information. She said she knew some things about the cold case murder of Tim Hack and Kelly Drew that she believed could help investigators close the case. However, this information that she had implicated one of the men closest to her life, her father, Edward Wayne Edwards, a former Marine with a long history of crime. April was a curious child growing up, and her father's unusual life was the most fascinating puzzle to her. Throughout her life, she had questions about how her father lived and why the family had to move around so often. One day, when she was now an adult, she came across the news article about the unsolved murders of Tim Hack and Kelly Drew, and she remembered that they had moved from Concord, Wisconsin around that time. The puzzle was finally falling into place, and she just knew she had to contact authorities. Edward Wayne Edwards was born in Akron, Ohio in 1933. He lost his parents at a young age and had to live in an orphanage run by nuns. Edward's time at the orphanage was marked with physical and emotional abuse, ultimately shaping him into a restless and rebellious teenager. He had several run-ins with the police for petty crimes like shoplifting and breaking and entering. And by 17, he was serving time at a juvenile detention center. By 1951, when Edward was 18, he was released from juvenile detention on the condition that he joined the U.S. Marines. But after just a few months as a Marine, Edward disappeared and had to be dishonorably discharged. He wasn't ready to leave the life of crime behind, because Edward soon found himself in jail again for robbery. By 1955, when he was 22, he escaped from jail in Akron and traveled across different states robbing gas stations. Edward would spend the rest of his 20s and 30s as a fugitive, drifting around the country while doing odd jobs here and there, working as a ship docker, vacuum cleaner retailer, and handyman. From his autobiography, it is easy to tell that Edward enjoyed his notoriety during this period. According to him, he never tried to use an alias or disguise his identity while committing his crimes because he wanted to be famous. In 1960, at 27, Edward was once again in prison, this time for attempting to impersonate a federal officer. However, he escaped from the Portland, Oregon jail where he was being held, prompting the FBI to place him on its 10 most wanted list in 1961. In 1962, authorities caught up with Edward and imprisoned him in the United States Penitentiary, Leavenworth, but he was paroled in 1967 for good behavior. In his memoir, he attributed his growth to the influence of a benevolent card at Leavenworth. After his parole, Edward got married and became a motivational speaker. In 1972, at age 39, Edward appeared on 2 television shows, To Tell the Truth and What's My Line. That same year, he released his autobiography, The Metamorphosis of a Criminal, true life story of Ed Edwards. It seemed like the stars were finally lining up for Edward. He had beaten the system. He was on his way to success. Unfortunately, Edward's good luck did not last long. In 1977, he committed his first murder. His victims were 21-year-old Billy Lavaco and his girlfriend, 18-year-old Judith Straub, residents of Sterling, Ohio. Billy and Judith went on a date on August 7, 1977, but never returned. Later that day, he in the parking lot of Silver Creek Metro Park, with her shoes and purse still inside. The following day, August 8th, Norton Police, assisted by family members and a National Guard helicopter, launched a search for Billy and Judith. The search party found their bodies in the high weeds near the Metro Park. They had been shot point blank with a 20-gauge shotgun. At the time, investigators could not connect Billy and Judith's case to Edward, so he got away with the murders. These murders also established a pattern that would continue with the murders of Tim and Kelly. Meanwhile, by 1982, when he was 49, Edward was back behind bars in Pennsylvania for arson. But he was still proud of his criminal accomplishments because in 1993, he wrote a letter to the FBI requesting his criminal and history records for cities in 19 states. The records were supposedly for a new book he was writing about criminals he met while in prison, such as Tony Provenzano, Charles Manson, and Jimmy Hoffa. In 1996, Edward, 63 years old, committed his third murder. His victim was his foster son, 25-year-old Danny Boy Edwards, who lived with him in Burton, Ohio, for 7 years. Before he met his grisly end, Danny Boy was a soldier in the U.S. Army. Edward somehow convinced him to abscond from the Army and return home. When he got home, Edward tricked him into entering the nearby woods and then killed him with 2 gunshots to the face. Edward left Danny Boy's body in a shallow grave. A hunter eventually found it there and alerted the authorities. But like his first set of murders, Edward also got away with murdering Danny Boy for the next couple of years. People close to Edward, like his son John and his daughter April, described him as a troubled man. He was extremely abusive to his wife and children, resulting in his children moving away from home as soon as possible to escape his abuse. Investigators believed Edward fit the bill for the stereotypical serial killer. He had a long history of crime. He was physically violent with his family members. And the fact that he wrote a book about his crimes showed that he was a narcissist. Edward also had military experience, so he would have known how to tie the knot on the ropes investigators believed were used to strangle Kelly. In addition, Edward's history of arson fits perfectly with the image of someone extremely controlling. By the time he was in his mid-70s, he was overweight and had to move around in a wheelchair depending on an oxygen tank to breathe. So his neighbors in Louisville, Kentucky had no idea that behind his elderly facade lay an evil mind that had done so much damage. However, with new evidence in April statements, investigators now had a more solid reason to believe Edward might have been involved in the murders. They had to visit him. When investigators got to his home in Louisville and initially began questioning him, Edward denied knowing anything about the murders of Tim Hack and Kelly Drew. He claimed he hadn't heard anything about them going missing, although he had been questioned about it in 1980. But while investigators doubled down and pressed him more, confessed that he had drank some beers at the Concord house on that fateful night, and that he may have seen the couple while he was drinking. He also said, contrary to his earlier statement, he had not been deer hunting that night. After the interview, investigators asked if they could take a swab of his saliva for DNA testing. Edward confidently said they could, believing the DNA test would not reveal anything he did not want investigators to know about. When the state crime lab tested Edward's DNA sample, it matched the DNA found on Kelly's pants. In 2009, Edwards had settled in a trailer park in Louisville, Kentucky. He was pleasant and friendly to his neighbors, and none of them suspected that he had such a dark history. That is until police picked him up and brought him to Wisconsin on July 31, 2009. He was charged with the murders of Tim Hack and Kelly Drew. While he was being interviewed, Edward was confronted with the results of the DNA test. Investigators asked him to explain how his bodily fluids came to be on Kelly's clothes. Edward started stuttering, cooking up a story about how he and Kelly had gotten intimate earlier that evening of August 9, 1980. But the act was consensual. He was shifting in his seat, moving his hands every which way, when he sensed the investigators were not buying his performance. He sighed and muttered something under his breath. After replaying the interview recording hundreds of times, investigators were confident they had heard what Edward said. "Damn it, I killed her." It was as good a confession as any. The gig was up for Edward, and he decided to plead guilty to the murder of Tim Hack and Kelly Drew. In April 2010, Edward Wayne Edwards was convicted of the 1980 Sweetheart murders and given 2 life sentences to run concurrently. Although Edward had asked to be executed, Wisconsin had no death penalty. But according to retired homicide detective Phil Waters, Edward had been in and out of prison. He knows what life is like. He's not a guy that wants to be sitting in a prison ward somewhere and dying a slow death. So hoping to convince the state to give him the death penalty, Edward wrote a letter to the Ohio prosecutor's office saying, "You're going to want to put a needle in my." Edward confessed to the murders of 21-year-old Billy Lovaco and 18-year-old Judith Straub, but it turned out that when he committed the murders in 1977, the death penalty was unconstitutional, so he did not get his wish. Instead, he was given a life sentence for each murder, but he still had one trick up his sleeve. In 2011, during a jailhouse interview, Edward confessed to killing his foster son, 25-year-old Danny Boy Edwards. His motive was the $250,000 life insurance policy he was set to receive upon Danny Boy's death. This time, his plan worked. On March 8, 2011, Edward was sentenced to death for the murder of Danny Boy Edwards. Although he was only convicted of 5 murders, police speculate that he could have at least 9 to 15 more undiscovered victims. In the book titled Peyton Allen Files, the author, Phil Stanford, suggested that Edward might have been responsible for the murders of Beverly Allen and Larry Peyton, which took place in Portland, Oregon in 1960. In March 2017, Detective Chad Garcia from the Jefferson County Sheriff's Office, one of the investigators in charge of the Sweetheart murders, suggested that Edward might have been responsible for 15 other murders, including the famous Zodiac killings. Retired homicide detective John Cameron also believed Edward was responsible for the Zodiac killings and other high-profile unsolved cases. But these claims have not been proven as of yet, so they are considered conspiracy theories. On April 7, 2011, Edward Edwards passed away at the Corrections Medical Center, Columbus, Ohio, at age 77. His death was of natural causes, a relatively merciful ending to a vicious crime spree that left 5 dead and dozens racked with grief. Edward escaped execution by lethal injection, which had been set for August 31, 2011. although Edward was eventually arrested, and he ultimately did not get away with the murders of Tim and Kelly. Their family members have not exactly found relief in that. Kelly's mother Norma Walker said instead of getting closure, Edward's arrest ripped open old wounds. She said, "You hope this day would come, but now that it's here, it's really hard. Everything starts all over again. All the memories come back. He robbed me of my daughter, robbed me of my Christmases, birthdays, weddings, everything families do together." As for Tim's family, the fact that their son and his girlfriend's killer had been found was enough. Tim's father, David, said he was just glad it's over and was grateful for the DNA technology that confirmed Edward was the killer. April Bellagio, Edward's daughter whose tip helped close the cold case, now spends her time trying to help the families of victims with unsolved cases find closure. Through her podcast, The Clearing, she investigates cold murder cases and tries to get authorities to reopen them. With him, Hack and Kelly Drew had a bright future ahead of them that was violently snatched away by their killer, Edward Edwards. Edward, the serial killer, had nothing personal against the couple. They just happened to be in the wrong place at the wrong time, which makes it all the more tragic. Although Edward ultimately got arrested and sentenced to death for his crimes, some believe he escaped justice by dying of natural causes just weeks before he was scheduled to be executed. 19-year-old Lindy Sue Beechler lived in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania in 1975. She had just recently got married. At about 8:45 p.m. on December 5, 1975, Lindy's aunt and uncle stopped by her apartment to exchange recipes. Instead, they found a horrific scene. There was blood on the front door, the entranceway wall, and on the carpet. They found Lindy's body on the living room floor. She had been stabbed 19 times with 2 different knives and assaulted. Investigators collected all forensic evidence they could at the crime scene. There were no signs of forced entry. Witnesses also didn't hear or see anything strange. In 1997, as DNA advanced, detectives with the Lancaster County District Attorney's Office submitted Lindy's underwear for DNA analysis. The lab found male DNA on it and could then create a DNA profile of the suspect. Recently, in 2019, investigators teamed up with C.C. Moore, who is the chief genetic genealogist at Parabon Nanolabs. Parabon created a composite sketch of the suspect based on the DNA evidence they had. In 2020, CC used DNA to build a family tree of the suspect. She found that he had deep roots in the local Lancaster community. She also found that the family tree of this unknown suspect contained many recent immigrant families from the tiny town of Gasparina, Italy. Finally, the search was narrowed down to 68-year-old David Sinopoli. Investigators learned that Sinopoli lived in the same apartment complex as Lindy. To ensure that it was his DNA that was left at the crime scene, authorities began surveilling Sinopoli, who didn't go out much in public. On February 11, 2022, investigators were able to obtain Sinopoli's DNA from a coffee cup he drank from and threw in the garbage at the airport. DNA found on Sinopoli's coffee cup was compared to DNA identified from the male DNA on Lindy's underwear. In June, investigators learned that the 2 spots of blood found on Lindy's pantyhose was consistent with the DNA profile obtained from her underwear. Detectives had long believed that the suspect had cut himself during the attack. Sinopoli is being held in Lancaster County Prison without bail. Investigators do not believe Sinopoli and Lindy knew each other. It was just a crime of opportunity. When a clown appeared in front of Marlene Warren's door and presented her with flowers and balloons, she didn't know that the clown was a killer with a gun hidden away in a costume. For over 3 decades, the case of the killer clown remained a mystery to detectives, Florida residents, and true crime enthusiasts all over the world. Marlene Warren was born on the 15th of April, 1950. When she turned 22, she married Michael Warren, who was 19 years old at the time. Marlene already had 2 children from her previous marriage, and Michael appeared to consider her 2 young sons to be his own. The couple grew together, working hard and making a name for themselves. They bought a number of companies, including a used car dealership for Michael. The family was able to maintain a reasonable standard of living because of their several revenue streams. Life for them was like a bed of roses, such that they could afford a 500-square-foot house in Wellington, Florida's upscale Aero Club neighborhood. Each of the homes in this area have their own runway and hangar, which enabled residents to fly their private aircraft whenever they like. The Warrens appeared to have it all, yet this was not the case at all. At his auto dealership in 1983, Michael experienced legal troubles. Customers accused him of fiddling with the odometer, and the authorities arrested him. He was consequently given an 18-month probationary period. By the year 1990, it was widely known that the Warrens were experiencing marital issues. Michael was allegedly having an affair with Sheila Keene, one of his staff. Despite Sheila and Michael's denials to this allegations, Sheila's husband decided to leave her. On May 26, 1990, a white Chrysler LeBaron with no license plate traveled down the street where Michael and Marlene lived. Marlene and a friend were in the kitchen when they saw a clown-costumed person approach the front door with a basket of flowers and balloons. Marlene grew up in a clown-loving family. Her family adored clowns so much that her mother keeps a whole room filled with clown collectibles. She had paintings of clowns that 14-year-old Marlene had created. For the adoration of clowns, Marlene hurried to the front door to welcome her visitor. Her son, Joseph Aarons, who was present at the time, recalled hearing his mother comment, "How pretty." This appeared to have been Marlene's last words, because a short while afterwards, everyone in the house, including Joseph's friends who came visiting, heard a pop sound. At first they thought the noise was a balloon popping, but then they noticed Marlene tumbling to the ground. Now at alert, everyone sped to the door. The balloons and flowers were left behind as the clown nonchalantly made his way back to the white Chrysler LeBaron. Joseph tried to run after the clown, but he couldn't go as far because he had a cast on his leg. He, however, remembered screaming at the clown to turn around. The clown turned and gave him a wide-eyed brown stare. His face lacked any expression. The clown soon climbed the white LeBaron and sped off. The sole description offered by witnesses was that Marlene had been shot by a clown with brown eyes. Even the gender of the clown was a mystery to them. Joseph and one of his friends had tried to follow the clown in their own car, but they lost track of it. Marlene Warren was rushed to the hospital. It was determined that she had been shot twice in the face at point-blank range. She struggled to survive, but died 2 days later at the hospital. Detectives checked in with Michael Warren, who wasn't home at the time of the incident. Michael had a solid alibi. He got the terrible news while en route to a Miami racetrack with friends. He hastily went back home to offer comfort to the family. When questioned by the detectives, he provided as much information, cooperating with the investigation process. He was soon ruled out as a suspect. The authorities were perplexed. According to a spokesman for the Palm Beach County Sheriff, the killer clown case was the strangest thing he had ever seen in all of his 19 years working as a law enforcement agent. 2 hours after the murder, authorities got a solid tip. A caller who wished to remain unnamed suggested that the police should thoroughly question Michael Warren and Sheila Keene. Before the police could ask her any more questions, she hung up. Sheila Keene was in town at the time of the murder, but Michael was traveling with friends. Sheila claimed to have been at work, but in reality, she was a repo person for Michael's dealership. Her alibi wasn't exactly solid. A few days after Marlene Warren's killer clown case made headlines, 2 employees of the neighborhood costume store named the Spotlight reported a weird experience to the police. They claimed that one woman with chocolate brown hair came up to them just as they were about to lock up the store. She pleaded to be allowed inside. The employees informed her that they were closed and advised her to come back the following day. She, however, was persistent and informed them that she really needed a costume that evening. It was a strange request because it wasn't Halloween. It was almost Labor Day weekend. Regardless, the 2 employees were sympathetic and allowed her enter the store. She was claimed to have bought white makeup, a red nose, white gloves, an orange afro wig, and a clown outfit. Later on in the investigation, the 2 employees selected Sheila Keene from a lineup of photos and declared that they were fairly certain that she was the woman who showed up begging to buy a clown costume. The detective soon looked into the supermarket store that sold the flowers and balloons the clown had brought to Marlene's house. It was discovered that the supermarket was close to Sheila Keene's house at the time. Also, the supermarket staff selected Sheila from a lineup of photos. The white Chrysler LeBaron, the getaway vehicle, came into consideration next. When asked, Michael Warren asserted that he had no knowledge of the vehicle. He claimed only Chevrolets were sold at his dealership, but Payless, his main rival, had a Chrysler LeBaron. Michael and Payless had a history of disagreements, especially over an advertisement that Michael's dealership ran that included the phrase, Payless, and was purported to be an attempt to confuse buyers. One time, a client from outside the area rented a white Chrysler LeBaron from Payless. The customer searched up Payless' number when it was time to return the car, but ended up contacting Michael's dealership instead. The client said they were instructed to park the vehicle outside the dealership with the keys inside the sun visor. The LeBaron, however, later vanished. After the murder, the getaway vehicle used by the clown was abandoned in a grocery store parking lot. During their search, police discovered orange synthetic threads in the vehicle that resembled a clown wig strands. They also discovered brown long hairs. Sheila Keene had long brown hair at the time of the murder. The police found more orange fake hair strands inside her residence during a search warrant. At this point, everything seemed like a simple situation to resolve. But that wasn't the case. Michael and Sheila vehemently denied being involved in Marlene's murder. They refuted having a conversation with the police without the presence of a lawyer. DNA testing was just getting started in 1990, so the investigators' available evidence was circumstantial. The investigation into Marlene's murder was abandoned, but Michael's legal issues intensified. During the course of the investigation into the murder, Michael's unlawful business dealings came to light. Police discovered proof of additional odometer tampering and consumer overcharging. Following the arrest of an employee, Michael surrendered himself to the police. In 1992, Michael's case went to trial, and he was sentenced to 4 years in prison. After being released in 2002, Michael married Sheila Keene a few years later. The couple started a new life in Tennessee by operating a restaurant. Sheila changed her name to Debbie and informed the community that it was a childhood nickname. Michael must be a good businessman because his new restaurant was a success. The couple's success allowed them to settle in Heron Point, a posh neighborhood close to the Virginia-Tennessee border. They made lots of friends and fit in well with their new neighbors. Few locals were familiar with their history. Michael told their new community that he has owned restaurants since he was a teenager. Marlene Warren's demise benefited Michael as well. He was the beneficiary of Marlene's life insurance policy, not her son. He took over $50,000 from Marlene's family, leaving them with virtually nothing. Detectives had their suspicions, but there was no concrete proof on ground. Michael and Sheila were immediately suspected of the crime, but a grand jury was never convened to that effect. Earlier in the investigation, the police were informed by Michael's acquaintances that they had seen arguments between him and Marlene, and that Marlene had questioned Sheila about her and Michael's affair. Above all, they claimed Michael didn't seem overly saddened by Marlene's passing. Detectives knew they merely needed to fit the puzzle pieces together, because there were many of them. DNA was the case's linchpin. Police took blood and hair samples from Sheila in 1990, but they lacked the equipment to analyze them. Over 25 years passed as the samples rested in a cooler. Police were able to reactivate Marlene Warren's cold case in 2013, thanks to a federal grant they were able to obtain. They had previously tried DNA testing, but the results were inconclusive. Fortunately, technology has improved and produced sufficient evidence to charge Sheila for Marlene's murder. In September 2017, Michael and Sheila were stopped by authorities 5 minutes away from their home. They were unaware that Marlene Warren's cold case had been reopened. 27 years after the murder, the police informed them that an arrest warrant had been issued for Sheila Keene Warren. Michael Warren still maintains that neither he nor Sheila are involved. In an interview, when questioned if he was involved in the killing of his first wife, Michael replied with, "Definitely not." He further said he wouldn't have been with Sheila if he thought she had anything to do with Marlene's murder. A lawyer named Christopher DeSantis told detectives about a fascinating chat he had with Michael Warren before Marlene was killed. DeSantis claimed that Michael had questioned him about what would happen, theoretically speaking, if a husband murdered his wife. He recalled telling Michael that the husband would escape punishment if a friend of his committed the murder, and there was no way to connect the husband to the friend. Intriguingly, DeSantis also recalled telling Michael that if someone was dressed as a clown, they would get away with it, because it would be impossible to identify them. Despite this, the evidence isn't sufficient for the police to accuse Michael Warren of killing his wife Marlene. Marlene's son Joseph Aarons, who was a teenager at the time of his mother's death, remembered it as one of the worst days of his life. He expressed his desire for justice in an interview, but he would not specify whether he thought Michael was somehow involved in his mother's death. Sheila was locked away for 5 years before her trial commenced. During those times, she and Michael's love endured. They wrote each other several letters. After trial, Sheila Keene pleaded guilty to second-degree murder and was given 12 years in prison. Loretta Jones's case transports us to the town of Price, Utah, in the United States. Price, with a population of less than 9,000 people as per the 2010 census, is the largest city in Carbon County. It provides a suburban ambience for its residents, who predominantly reside in their own homes. renowned for its captivating rock formations, expansive deserts, and breathtaking canyons. Price offers a picturesque setting for recreational pursuits. According to statistics, the likelihood of falling victim to a crime in Price is approximately 1 in 156. It is within this tranquil town that our story unfolds. Loretta Jones resided in Price alongside her 4-year-old daughter, Heidi Jones. Despite being young and unmarried, Loretta strived to make ends meet for herself and her daughter. She wholeheartedly dedicated herself to Heidi, who fondly reminisces about the cherished moments they shared together. Loretta was responsible for creating the majority of the clothing that Heidi wore during her childhood, as well as the clothes for her dolls. Together, they led a joyful and content life. However, their happiness was abruptly cut short. On that warm summer night of July 30th, 1970, Heidi bid her mother goodnight, unaware that it might be the last time she would see her alive. The following morning, July 31st, 1970, Heidi woke up to a devastating sight in the living room of their home. Her mother, Loretta, lay lifeless on the floor. Being too young to fully comprehend the situation, Heidi left the house and encountered her neighbors Sue and Hovart, who was engaged in worm-digging activities near her apartment. Upon seeing Heidi, Hovart gestured for her to come closer and witness her task. However, Heidi responded with a heartbreaking statement. "I can't. I think my mommy is dead." These words prompted Hovart to immediately abandon her activity and accompany Heidi back to Loretta's home to assess the situation. Inside, Hovart discovered Loretta lying face down, partially unclothed, with blood covering her back and hair. Hovart promptly contacted the police, and the police chief Art Poloni promptly arrived at the scene. The police, arriving at approximately 11:40 a.m. on July 31st, 1990, confirmed Loretta's demise. The living room was saturated with blood, and Loretta had sustained 17 stab wounds. Interestingly, there were no signs of forced entry indicating that the perpetrator was likely known to Loretta. Furthermore, Loretta did not exhibit any defensive wounds, suggesting that she had not attempted to protect herself during the attack. The medical examiner determined that Loretta had been killed with a small narrow knife and had traces of bodily fluid on her. Unfortunately, DNA testing was still in its infant stages at that time. As there were no CCTV cameras to capture the events, the investigators turned to the young girl present in the house during the incident, hoping to gather some information. Heidi informed the investigators that after her mother had put her to bed, Loretta had returned to caution her against leaving her room. Heidi, in her statement to the investigators, mentioned that she had never heard her mother scream or struggle on the night of the murder. However, she did bring up something that raised concerns among the investigators. Heidi explicitly stated, "Tom did it, Tom killed my mom." Heidi's grandmother diligently recorded every word Heidi uttered during that time, and there was an entry in her notepad on the morning the body was discovered. Heidi confided in her grandmother, accusing Tom of being responsible for her mother's death. Eventually, they stumbled upon Loretta's diary, which contained a name similar to the one Heidi had mentioned, Thomas Egley. According to the diary, Thomas and Loretta had been in a relationship for 2 months prior to her demise, and that was the extent of the information they could gather about him. The investigators found themselves with very little to work with in this case, apart from the name mentioned by a 4-year-old Heidi, who was asleep at the time of the murder. However, the police soon received another lead to pursue. At around 9:30 p.m., Kulo Fennell, a 10-year-old girl residing 3 blocks away from Loretta's house, was outside riding her bike with her brother. As darkness began to fall, Kulo's brother went inside the house, leaving his bike behind, while Kulo remained outside alone. As she approached the front door, a man suddenly attacked her from behind, covering her mouth with his hand. Fortunately, Kulo managed to free herself from the kidnapper's grasp and let out a piercing scream. Startled, the man fled the scene. Kulo caught a glimpse of her assailant and the direction he fled towards. She informed the police that he ran in the direction of Loretta's house. Later, at the police station, Thomas Egley's photograph was included in a lineup, as he was already a suspect in a murder case that occurred on the same night. Kulo identified Thomas as the person who attempted to abduct her, leading to his apprehension for questioning. The investigators believed that Kulo's case and Loretta's murder were connected. On August 1st, 1970, they interrogated Thomas regarding both incidents separately, to which he vehemently denied any involvement. Thomas claimed that on the night of the homicide, he caught a ride with a group of teenagers who later dropped him off at a fast food establishment where he had hamburgers. Subsequently, he stated that he proceeded to a bar named Highway Rendezvous on Springland Road at approximately 11:30 p.m., and after that he returned to his residence. According to Thomas, he did not encounter Loretta on that particular day. In order to verify Thomas's account, the investigators visited the bar and inquired if they had indeed seen him that night. The bar owner confirmed that she had seen him, noting that he appeared somewhat anxious, nervous, and had red speckles on his shirt. The investigators questioned Thomas regarding the red speckles mentioned on his shirt, to which he explained that it was likely paint residue as he had been engaged in painting activities throughout the day. Despite his explanation, the investigators proceeded to collect the clothing Thomas claimed to have worn that night, as well as his hair, blood, and fingerprint samples. The fibers that they discovered on Tom's clothing did match the fibers that were found to be similar to those on Loretta Jones' rug. Investigators believed they had sufficient probable cause to apprehend Thomas, and they did so. Thomas was taken into custody while residing in a motel in Helper, Utah, alongside his girlfriend, who was 8 months pregnant. However, during the preliminary hearing on November 5, 1970, the defense presented witnesses who provided an alibi for Thomas. The prosecutor argued that the fiber evidence resembled the rug in Loretta's home, but this alone was insufficient, considering Thomas had previously visited Loretta's residence. Nevertheless, due to Colo Fennell's identification of Thomas as the individual who attempted to abduct her, he faced charges of attempted kidnapping and spent 90 days in jail. Following his release, Thomas reintegrated into society and relocated to Rockford, Colorado in 1971. Despite this, Loretta's case remained unresolved. Over the years, grappled with the trauma of her mother's death, confiding in her grandmother, who had taken her in immediately after the incident. Heidi consistently expressed her belief that Tom was responsible for her mother's murder, and her grandmother diligently documented every detail in a journal. Heidi also disclosed that Tom had frequently subjected Loretta to physical abuse. Eventually, the adults in the household attempted to suppress Heidi's recollections and discourage her from discussing the matter further. Although Heidi ceased discussing it openly, she never forgot what transpired in 1970. As Heidi matured, she realized the extent of the attack her mother endured and felt compelled to seek justice by bringing Tom to the sheriff's office for questioning. Decades passed and Heidi moved forward with her life, but her mother's case remained etched in her memory. While Heidi cherished her mother's memory, she did not actively advocate for the reopening of the case. However, one fateful day, Heidi found herself captivated by a television show called Unsolved Mysteries. This show sparked a fire within her, igniting a determination to seek justice for her mother. Undeterred by previous disappointments, she embarked on a massive letter-writing campaign, reaching out to the Federal Bureau of Investigation, Price City Police Department, and Carbon County Sheriff. Unfortunately, her efforts were met with silence, but this did not deter her spirit. Heidi persisted, pouring her heart and soul into each letter she wrote. Then, in 2009, a glimmer of hope emerged when Heidi made a post on her social media platform. To her surprise, one of her former high school friends, David Brewer, responded. As they reconnected after years of separation, discovered that David was now working with the Carbon County Sheriff. This revelation presented a golden opportunity for Heidi to reopen her mother's cold case. Determined to seize this chance, Heidi intentionally crossed paths with David at a local arts festival. Their encounter allowed her to engage in a heartfelt conversation about her mother's tragic fate. Moved by Heidi's emotional account, David was astounded that he had never heard of her story during their high school years. Heidi recounted the haunting memory of her mother's final moments, describing how her mother kissed her goodnight before warning her to stay hidden in her room. It was as if her mother had foreseen the impending danger. Heidi also shared her belief that Tom, a figure from her hazy recollections, was responsible for her mother's demise. She vaguely remembered witnessing a distressing scene involving Tom and her mother, possibly involving coercion or violence, but she never heard her mother scream. Deeply affected by Heidi's narrative, David made a heartfelt decision to assist her in seeking justice for her mother. As a result, Loretta's case was finally reopened. However, David faced numerous challenges in his pursuit of the truth. The crime files had mysteriously vanished, leaving him with only past media coverage and Heidi's fragmented memories. Undeterred, David embarked on a mission to locate Thomas, who was now residing in Rockford, Colorado, for further questioning. When Thomas was questioned about the events of July 30th, 1970, he was able to recall what he ate and did throughout the day. However, he claimed to have no recollection of Loretta or her name. This raised suspicions for David, who began to believe that Thomas might be the killer. Unfortunately, without any concrete evidence, David had no choice but to leave without arresting Thomas. In his pursuit of the truth, David also sought out Marcia Hidalgo, a former girlfriend to Thomas. Marcia informed David that Thomas arrived home late on the night of the murder and immediately took a bath with his clothes on. The following day, Thomas went to the laundromat and returned home missing several clothing items. Marcia questioned Thomas about his whereabouts, and he claimed to have delivered hamburgers to a woman and her daughter. Although David couldn't fully make sense of this information, it further strengthened his belief that Thomas was responsible for Loretta's murder. Exhausting all other options, David contemplated exhumation as a last resort. However, he was unsure of how Heidi, Loretta's daughter, would react to such a request. Surprisingly, when David shared his thoughts with Heidi, she expressed her willingness to even dig the grave herself if it meant obtaining justice for her mother. With Heidi's support, they proceeded with the exhumation, which proved to be emotionally challenging for her. Unfortunately, due to water damage, the body was unable to provide the evidence they needed. Nevertheless, they decided to exaggerate the outcome to the public, claiming to have found new evidence that had led them closer to solving the case. This news spread far and wide, catching the attention of a woman named Linda, who contacted David after seeing the exhumation on TV. Linda shared her recollections with the investigators, providing them with potentially valuable information. Linda informed David Brewer that Loretta had inscribed the killer's name using her blood. David, taken aback, inquired about how she obtained this information given that the police had restricted access to the crime scene. Linda clarified that she resided at Heidi's grandmother's residence during high school, which coincided with the time of the murder. Following the incident, Heidi's grandfather requested Linda and one of Heidi's aunts to visit Loretta's house to pack Heidi's belongings. Linda mentioned that this allowed them entry, and upon arrival, she witnessed a capital T and an O with her own eyes. This discovery was a significant breakthrough, but they required a photo of the crime scene to substantiate it. David met with Heidi, shared the new details, and expressed his frustration over the absence of crime scene photos. Heidi suddenly recalled a photo possibly stored in a box of belongings her grandmother had preserved over the years. They proceeded to search the grandmother's house for the box, subsequently looked for the photo inside. The box contained everything related to the case, including her grandmother's journal documenting Heidi's statements. However, the most unsettling find was a photo of Heidi beside her mother's body outline, which proved to be crucial. The image depicted Heidi and her mother's blood with the letters T and O. David Brewer began connecting the dots. Upon reading the journal, he learned about Tom's mistreatment of Heidi's mother and Heidi's accusations against him. The key revelation was Loretta's attempt to identify her killer by writing with her blood, managing only to inscribe an O before succumbing. However, even with the photograph, the detectives required additional evidence to apprehend Thomas Egley, who is now suspected to be Tom in this particular case. The investigation came to a standstill once again, until an individual decided to provide invaluable assistance to the investigators. Lisa Carter, a woman who resided near Thomas, contacted the police department to inform them that she was his neighbor. She revealed that Thomas had approached her after she had watched the exhumation video, requesting her to look after his dogs as he anticipated the police might come for him soon. Lisa Carter also believed that Thomas was the perpetrator behind Loretta's murder, and thus she offered her help in the case. She requested permission from the police to wear a recording device in order to obtain Thomas's confession. The police agreed and arrangements were made accordingly. Lisa approached Thomas and fabricated a story, informing him that her husband had been training to become a detective in Utah. She informed Thomas that he had become a topic of discussion as he was already known as Loretta Jones's murderer. All of these statements affected Thomas ugly, but he did not confess as he still harbored doubts about Lisa's trustworthiness. However, after 2 days of attempting to gain Thomas's trust, on July 26, 2016, he began to open up to Lisa about the events that occurred on the night of July 30, 1970. Thomas admitted that he had knocked on Loretta's door and she had allowed him to enter. He claimed that he had intended to engage in an intimate encounter with her, but Loretta rejected his advances, causing him to feel worthless. According to Thomas, Loretta left him in the living room to retrieve something from the kitchen, and upon her return, he grabbed a small knife and stabbed her. After stabbing Loretta, Thomas proceeded to engage in a consensual intimate act with her, despite Lisa's confusion regarding the consent given Loretta's initial refusal. When questioned about what happened next, Thomas revealed that he completely lost control, proceeded to slit Loretta's throat. Lisa reported that Thomas expressed no remorse for his actions, indicating that he only cared about his own safety. Thomas's arrest was based on a crucial confession provided by him, which served as the key evidence for the investigators. Loretta's sister, Carolyn Kendall, had limited knowledge about Thomas Egley. She only knew that Loretta had gone on a blind date with him once, but Loretta had expressed her dislike for Thomas and wanted no further involvement with him. This explains why Loretta rejected Thomas's advances on that fateful night. Thomas Egley, a 76-year-old local drifter, had a history of an unstable home life, multiple relationships with women, and 3 previous marriages. Despite having 5 children, he mostly lived a solitary life. In August 2016, Thomas was charged with first-degree felony murder and forced intimacy in the 7th District Court. Under Utah law at the time, Thomas's official charge was second-degree criminal homicide murder. On August 18, 2016, Thomas was arrested without any complications in Rocky Ford, Colorado, based on a $1 million warrant. Eventually, Thomas pleaded guilty to the murder, resulting in the dismissal of his assault case. On November 22, 2016, he received a sentence of 10 years to life. Throughout the proceedings, Thomas showed little remorse, except for a written statement read by his attorney, David Allred, which seemed insincere. Thomas even expressed his belief that he should be released, as he hadn't committed any crimes since Loretta's murder. In court, he questioned why the family of the deceased chose to reopen a case from 46 years ago, indicating a lack of remorse. According to Thomas, he was unaware that Heidi, Loretta's daughter, was present in the room when he killed her mother. Loretta was aware of this, which explains her lack of resistance or screams during the attack. It is likely that Thomas would not have spared Heidi if he had known she was there. Upon receiving his sentence, he voiced his dissatisfaction to the judge regarding his confinement in the state prison located in Salt Lake County, as it prohibited any visitors. In response, the judge advised him to pursue an appeal. Heidi, who had endured immense pain for over 4 decades, finally had the chance to confront her mother's killer. She conveyed the profound trauma caused by her mother's death and expressed her desire for Thomas Egley to remain imprisoned, separated from his loved ones forever. She vowed to ensure that he would never be granted freedom, even if he became eligible for parole in 10 years. While some may view it as closure, Heidi regarded it as justice. She believed that no words could truly provide the closure and relief she sought, but the fact that justice had been served held immeasurable significance to her. Case of Matthew Winkler, Secrets of a Religious Family. Sometimes the most horrible and unpredictable crimes are committed in seemingly perfect families. Of course, even in the most prosperous unit of society can come crisis, which will be unnoticed by others, but literally poison the lives of all members of the family and eventually lead to tragedy. The Winklers, in the town of Selmer, were considered by many to be a model family. The young pastor, his wife, and their 3 daughters looked happy, had everything they needed for a comfortable life, were healthy and successful, but in a quiet pool, as they say. In this case, many questions remained unanswered because we heard only one version of what happened, and the story itself became the subject of the book, Sex and Murder, Secrets of a Pastor. March 22, 2006, the small town of Selmer, Tennessee, shook the terrible news. A 31-year-old pastor named Matthew Winkler was brutally murdered in his own home, and his wife Mary and their 3 daughters, 8-year-old Patricia, 6-year-old Maria Eliza, and 1-year-old Brianna, disappeared without a trace. That day, the preacher of the Church of Christ did not show up for the evening service where he was supposed to attend with his family. This circumstance seemed strange and suspicious, because Matthew was always very responsible and could not miss the planned event without informing anyone. None of the family members also answered the phone, which was even more disturbing. Alarmed community members decided to go to the Winklers' residence to find out what had happened and if they needed help. From the outside, the house looked normal. The windows and doors were intact, and nothing suspicious was visible. Inside, there were lights on in several rooms, and they could hear a television playing quite loudly in one of the rooms. It gave the impression that the owners of the house were busy doing their own thing. The front door was locked, but no one answered the knock. Phone calls also went unanswered, and through the curtain windows, it was impossible to see what was going on inside or if anyone was there. However, even though the whole situation was quite strange, no one was in a hurry to call the police. Instead, a call was made to an elder of the religious community who advised them to look for a spare key and open the door themselves. It took another hour and a half, And when members of the community were finally able to get inside the house, they found an eerie scene. Everything in the house was in its place. There was no sign of intruders, but the owners were nowhere to be seen either. Everything seemed normal until the visitors looked into the marital bedroom. There on the floor, in a pool of his own blood, lay the pastor's body. There was a huge hole in his back from a gunshot wound. Blood spattered everywhere, and bloody foam dried on his face. By then, the body had already cooled and stiffened. It was obvious that Matthew had been lying there for many hours and had probably been killed in the morning because he was dressed in his pajamas. It was only after this that a call was made to the police. By the time the police arrived, a whole crowd of neighbors, churchgoers, and casual passersby had gathered in and around the house, interested in what was going on. All of these people had left their fingerprints at the crime scene. They left their fingerprints and shoe prints, erased or trampled possible evidence, greatly complicating the work of investigators. The police took the body for forensic examination and found that the pastor was killed by a single shot in the back, fired from a large caliber weapon. He died a few minutes after the wound, from massive blood loss, unable to call for help. It was simply impossible to establish definitively whether there were any strangers in the house at that time, because the people who had arrived before the police arrived had literally destroyed all traces of them. The picture of the crime was quite strange, and those who could shed any light on what happened disappeared. The fate of the wife and daughters of the murdered man remained unknown. The police assumed that the woman and children could have been kidnapped or also killed. By the way, the family minivan Winklers also disappeared from the garage. A massive search was launched and the state issued a yellow alert. This meant that children were missing and all citizens were asked to be vigilant and assist in the search. But let's break this whole story down from the beginning. Matthew Brian Winkler was born in 1974, November 21st in the picturesque country town of Henderson, Tennessee, and was the youngest of 3 sons of Dan and Diane Winkler. Our hero and his 2 older brothers, James and Daniel, grew up in a rather conservative Christian family. Their parents were very religious and brought up their sons in strictness and obedience. It is worth noting that Matthew became a minister of the church in the 5th generation. His father, great-uncle Michael, grandfather Wendell, great-grandfather Merlin Winkler, and great-great-grandfather Merlin Paul Winkler Sr. were all preachers of the gospel at one time. The father, to top it all off, rammed the local preacher's school, and was a man respected and influential in his hometown. In their younger years, the Winkler brothers attended Sunday school and were active in church activities. In addition, Matthew in high school was seriously interested in soccer, and everyone who saw his game on the field noted that he had talent and he could well become an outstanding athlete of world renown. However, later the young man decided to sacrifice a promising sports career in favor of Bible study and church ministry. Since the preaching activity of the head of the family was associated with frequent travel, his wife and children almost always followed him. Because of this, Matthew changed several schools in his childhood, but the active, communicative, and friendly child quickly made friends and gained authority everywhere. When the boy finished school, his family lived in a small city called Austin, located in the state of Texas. Matthew was a creative person, had a powerful charisma, but here are some outstanding achievements in studies could not boast. After graduating from high school, he entered the college Fried Hardeman and successfully completed it. In parallel, the young man began to try his hand as a pastor under the careful guidance of his father. Matthew was the youth minister of the Central Church of Christ in the city of McMinnville. He was later appointed to the preaching position at the 4th Street Church of Christ in Selmer, Tennessee. Mary Carol Winkler, maiden name Freeman, was born in December 1973 in Geist Township, Tennessee, and was the oldest of 2 daughters to her parents. She was also raised in a deeply religious family with strict rules. The head of the family for many years served as a pastor in the Christian church where the girl attended Sunday school. A few years later, a second daughter was born to the family and named Patricia. Unfortunately, the girl was born prematurely and had a number of serious health problems, including cerebral palsy, encephalitis, epilepsy, and mental retardation. For many years, the parents did not want to put up with the disappointing diagnoses of the child and desperately tried to treat her, agreeing even to experimental therapy. However, it did not bring any particular improvement. Mary tenderly loved her little sister, always treated her with awe and cared for her as best she could. But in 1987, when 10-year-old Patricia was bathing in the bathtub, her older sister was only a minute away to take something from the bathing accessories. And at that very moment, the girl had another epileptic seizure. When Mary returned to the room, her sister was no longer breathing, and all attempts to resuscitate her had come to nothing. For a 13-year-old girl, it was a huge shock and the first loss in her life. She blamed herself for the tragedy and was on the verge of a nervous breakdown. Teachers who saw the deplorable state of Mary sent her to the school psychologist, working with whom she helped. But her father, learning about what was happening, made a scandal and forbade his daughter to go to these sessions, saying that such problems are discussed only within the family. In fact, the girl never received real moral support from her parents. Mary grew up modest and quite shy. She tried to avoid any conflicts, and after the tragic death of her little sister, she became withdrawn. Since her father did not allow her to seek help from a specialist, the trauma over the years has resulted in serious psychological problems. After the death of Patricia, the parents decided to adopt a little girl named Charlotte, who was from a dysfunctional large family. Soon the couple was also allowed to take custody of Charlotte's 2 brothers and sister, so the family was reunited in their new home. Mary was once again the older sister and took care of the younger children while helping her mother. Matthew and Mary Winkler. Family life. The future spouses met soon after Matthew graduated from high school. The guy was prominent, handsome, athletic, and enjoyed great popularity with the opposite sex. But to spin novels right and left, he did not allow a strict religious upbringing. The young people immediately developed a liking for each other, which quickly grew into love. For both of them, it was the first strong feeling in their lives, and after a couple of months they met each other's parents, and having received their blessing, began to plan a wedding. In April 1994, the lovers got married. When the family had an older daughter, Patricia, the head of the family, was still in college and was forced to leave school for a while. He took a job at a construction site, but long there did not last because he was not used to hard physical labor. During this period, for the first time made himself aware of the difficult character of Matthew. He was often angry with others, irritated at small things, and sometimes he could not control his anger. But Mary tried not to complain and not to tell anyone about what was happening in her family. A meek young woman brought up in the spirit of patriarchy obeyed her husband in everything. At first, the Winklers lived near the house of Mary's parents, so she was able to see them regularly. But soon Mrs. Freeman was diagnosed with cancer, which rapidly progressed. And in just a few months, she literally burned from the disease. It was another shock for Mary, and the care of her underage siblings now fell on her shoulders. The situation was further complicated by the fact that Mary was pregnant again at that time. But soon after the birth of their second daughter, the family moved to another city, where they bought their own small house. After the move, Mary was completely absorbed in the care of the baby, and almost stopped communicating with her father, as well as with younger brothers and sisters, who were too demanding and constantly needed attention. In addition, the young mother began to suffer from severe postpartum depression. Everyone who was closely acquainted with the family Winkler noted some oddities in the character and behavior of Mary. The young woman was characterized as an introvert and even sociophobic. She did not communicate with anyone. It was difficult for her to make new acquaintances, much less friendships. She suffered from mood swings, was prone to melancholy, and any little thing could bring her to tears. While Matthew was building his career as a pastor, his wife became increasingly withdrawn. The situation became even more complicated when Mary once again became pregnant, and a few months later, she learned that the fetus had died in her womb. Such news strongly shook Mary, who was looking forward to the appearance of this child and very much dreamed of a large, friendly family. Again, to see the long-awaited 2 stripes on the pregnancy test she could only 2 years later, and her happiness was unbounded. This time, hid her pregnancy for a long time, as if afraid of something. She did so until her situation became obvious. Once again, everyone began to talk about Mary's strange behavior and pathological reticence. The strange behavior of Mrs. Winkler was associated not only with the severe psychological trauma she suffered in childhood, but also with a very unhealthy environment within her own family, which only undermined her already unstable nervous system. The head of the family was a man of authority and demanded unconditional obedience. Despite the fact that in public the Winklers looked like an ideal married couple, where there was trust, mutual respect, and harmony, in reality, their neighbors have repeatedly heard how the husband shouted and snapped at his wife for no apparent reason. No one could even imagine that a respected pastor could raise a hand on his wife until one day Mary had a huge black eye. Despite the fact that she denied the fact of domestic violence and said that it was an accident, the city quickly spread rumors about the cruelty of a young preacher who beats the mother of his children. In addition, Matthew at some point developed an irresistible urge to experiment in bed. He offered his wife to diversify their intimate life with role-playing games. adult toys, and so on. But for Mary, brought up in strictness with conservative views, such was unacceptable. She strongly restricted her husband in this, which infuriated him, and he repeatedly tried to get what he wanted by force. One day, after another abuse in bed, Mary called her only close friend in tears and complained to her about the situation. The friend, who promised to keep her secret, immediately blabbed about everything, which provoked a new wave of rumors and gossip about the unacceptable behavior of the clergyman. At that time, Matthew was up for promotion and aspired to be a local church leader, but he was rejected because of rapidly spreading unpleasant rumors about him. Moreover, he was also removed from his position in the Sunday school, where he had brought God's word to the children and was in good standing. This was requested by the parents, who had also heard about the pastor's peculiar predilections. All this forced the family to leave their residence and move to another city where they planned to start over. They settled in Selmer, where they quickly gained the love and respect of those around them. Matthew took a job as a church pastor again, and his wife found a part-time job to make a small contribution to the family income. And although the family was still not smooth, their neighbors, as well as the congregation of the church where Matthew preached, considered Mary and Matthew an ideal couple and their family a model. Next door to the Winkler family lived a young married couple with whom the couple quickly became friends. They often visited each other, celebrated holidays together, shared news and secrets. A few months before the tragedy, during a joint dinner at the pastor's house, bragged to the neighbors that her husband had bought her a gun for self-defense and had already taken her to the shooting range several times to learn how to handle it confidently. Mary turned out to be quite a capable student, quickly mastered all the subtleties and accurately shot at targets. Moreover, it turned out that the Winklers already had firearms in the house, which had been purchased by the pastor earlier, also for self-defense. The guests wondered why the pastor and his wife needed all this, because they live in a quiet town where they have no enemies, and everyone around them loves and respects their family. After another move of the couple, their financial situation left much to be desired. Mary was in search of various part-time jobs, and she also decided to get a medical degree to get a job in a clinic and help sick children. Soon, Mary decided to improve the financial condition of their family through financial fraud. She herself later claimed that she did not realize that she was doing something illegal and was going to pay back all the money as soon as she got back on her feet. What Mary was doing is commonly referred to as artificially inflating account balances. Mrs. Winkler also received checks from unspecified sources and then deposited them into a bank account she and her husband owned. She then changed the address of the account so that all communications would be routed there. The total amount of checks she received was almost $17,000, which aroused certain suspicions of the bank employees who decided to invite the couple to the office branch to clarify the circumstances and resolve the situation. But the pastor and his wife never showed up at the bank, and this aroused even more suspicion. It was assumed that Matthew was not aware of what his wife was doing at all. However, after Matthew's death, his wife tried to prove in court that the whole story of fraud was his idea, and that it was he who forced her to make dubious transactions, while he himself remained in the shadows without arousing suspicion. Where has Mary disappeared to? When Mr. Winkler was found murdered in his own home, his wife and daughters were put on the wanted list, fearing that they too might be in mortal danger. Initially, the meek, shy, and homely Mary was initially viewed solely as a possible victim of the crime. However, after talking to neighbors and receiving information from the bank about financial fraud, she became the main suspect in the murder of her own husband. It was necessary to find out as soon as possible where Mary had disappeared to, where the children were, and if they were all right. They, as well as their family car, were put on the wanted list. Attempts were also made to trace transactions made from Mary's bank card and to locate her location through her cell phone signal. Mary was found just a day later in an Alabama resort town where she and her children were having fun at a local amusement park. It was as if the mother wanted to give her children one last party, realizing that she would soon be going to prison and would see her girls very soon. When the family was taken to the police station to testify, the two older daughters confidently told the same story. According to them, intruders broke into the house and injured their dad, and their mom picked up a gun to protect them. They were then forced to run for their lives. According to the girls, their father was alive and in the hospital, and they were soon to go and see him and return home. What exactly happened in the house, as it turned out, Patricia and Maria Eliza did not see, and learned about the events from the words of their mother. They only heard a gunshot and glimpsed their father lying on the floor, and then their mother put them in the car and they drove away. Mary almost immediately began to confess, but she claimed that she could not reconstruct the entire chain of events of that day, referring to the temporary blur. According to her, her spouse had abused her for years, humiliating her and inducing her to forms of intimacy that were unacceptable to her. Mary insisted that it was he who had initiated the financial scam she had perpetrated. Matthew demanded total obedience, easily lost his temper, and once gave the will of his fists. This was confirmed by Matthew's secretary at his previous place of employment. The woman repeatedly witnessed how the pastor insulted his wife, who carefully brought him lunch to church, but he was always dissatisfied with something. The evening before the tragedy, there was another scandal in the family, because of which the spouses went to bed in separate rooms. Mary cried all night, and in the morning she did not realize how in her hands was a shotgun, which her husband kept loaded. She entered Matthew's room and shot him in the back while he was still lying in bed. Matthew collapsed to the floor, bloody foam oozing from his mouth and nose. According to Mary, her husband, while still alive, whispered, "Why?" To which she replied, "I'm sorry, I'm so sorry." Mary then took her daughters and left the house, and her husband, as experts have established, tried to reach for the phone to call for help, but he no longer had the strength to do so. By the way, the weapon of crime was found in the trunk of the car on which Mary left with the children. For what purpose she took it with her, Mrs. Winkler also could not answer. At the trial, the role-playing costumes found in their home were presented as evidence of the pastor's humiliation and moral abuse of his wife. Upon seeing them, Mary turned pale and then became hysterical, despite the fact that she confused her testimony and told several different versions of what happened. The court agreed that she was the victim of a domestic tyrant, and the murder was the result of years of anger, resentment, and pain. However, this did not absolve Mary of responsibility for what she had done. In April 2007, the court delivered its final verdict in this complicated and confusing case. Mrs. Winkler was found guilty of involuntary manslaughter, but her mental state raised many questions. It was originally expected that the young woman would be sent to prison for at least 6 years, but in the end, she was given a sentence of less than 1 year. She spent 2 months of that sentence in a psychiatric hospital where experts were trying to determine whether she could regain custody of her children upon release. In the summer of 2008, Mary was given sole custody of her daughters, who all this time lived with their paternal grandparents. Matthew's parents were extremely upset by this circumstance. They believed that their daughter-in-law had deliberately killed their son and suffered virtually no punishment for it, and now their granddaughters were given full custody of her. However, all their numerous attempts to file appeals had failed. As for the fraud case, it never went to trial. The bank never filed formal charges, and the whole story was dropped. Today, our story repeats the biblical story of the first crime on earth. As the book of Genesis states, "And Cain rose up against his brother Abel and killed him." This occurred after Cain had sacrificed to the Almighty the fruits of the earth and Abel the firstborn lambs. To the disappointment of the older man, God accepted the younger man's sacrifice and rejected his gifts. Driven by selfish jealousy, Cain called Abel to the field and there took his life. But unfortunately, even in the modern world, because of unhealthy jealousy, the older brother can kill the younger one. The end of June 2010 was very difficult for the family of Donna and Samuel Eckerd. Their 19-year-old son, Sean, was missing. The night before, Sean had a fight with his older brother Stanley and left the house, slamming the door. Sean had never previously allowed himself to leave the house for long periods of time without his phone or informing his mother. Late that night, the whole family was alarmed by the young man's disappearance. But officially, the search for the boy began only 24 hours later. Missing person notices with photos of smiling, blonde-haired Sean were posted at all stations, in supermarkets, and along the streets. But even after 2 days of searching, there were no results. The police had their hands up in the air as they continued their search. For more than 2 days, Sean Paul Eckerd was officially missing. Relatives, acquaintances, and a few friends gathered a team of activists who day and night combed local establishments, interviewed random passersby, and minute by minute reconstructed the route of the guy that night. The police, without stopping the search, began to look more closely into the habits and rhythm of the Eckerd family to reconstruct the sequence of events leading up to Sean's disappearance. Donna and Samuel Eckerd married with a history of family relationships. They had 6 adult children from previous marriages. After experiencing difficulties and setbacks in their early unions, they found their safe haven in each other's company and settled in San Diego, California. They rented a large, good-sized family home and attended the local church on weekends without fail. The family was devout and lived a quiet and unsociable lifestyle. A few years after the family moved in, they had a son, Stanley, and 2 years later a second son, Sean. Donna devoted herself fully to the home and raising her sons. So the brothers grew up in love and care. They both attended a good local school, and on weekends, without fail, the whole family participated in church activities. The eldest children, having reached adulthood, flew away from their parents' nest all over the continent to start their own families. But the Eckert family was friendly. They kept in touch with each other, regularly called each other, and spent all family holidays together. Sean was a simple and fun-loving boy. He had a bright appearance, charisma, and insight that attracted people to him like a magnet. He knew how to listen and empathize, so he made friends very easily. Stanley, on the contrary, had a more reserved character and was wary of everything new. He was shy, so socializing with people was much more difficult for him than for his brother. They had one common group of friends and classmates, despite the age difference. Together, the brothers were like one, helping each other and always looking out for each other. The boys grew up well-mannered and studied very well. They always had a trusting and friendly relationship with each other. Small jokes about each other were accepted with humor by their parents. Respect was valued above all else in the family. Donna and Samuel raised their children from childhood with faith in God and according to God's laws. The life of the Eckert family flowed in its own way. As the brothers grew up, their interests unnoticeably became completely opposite. The youngest, Sean, played in the music band, and the eldest, Stanley, became interested in martial arts. The life of each young boy was filled with vivid impressions and emotions, which they shared with the family in the evenings. Sean was always first. His stories about music, friends, and upcoming plans took up most of the evening time. When the family gathered before dinner and shared the emotions of the day, everyone listened to Sean. There was no time for Stanley, nor, it seemed to him, was there much to share. No grandiose plans for the future, no exciting stories, not even stories of friends to draw attention to. So Stanley humbly listened to his brother's stories. On one such evening, Sean told his family that he had met a neighbor girl, Mary Jane. A fragile young girl with bright brown eyes and long blonde hair put Sean in a daze. Through the open window of the house where the girl lived, he heard a magical piano playing. As if mesmerized, he went to the captivating sounds of music and entered the house without knocking. Self-confidence in his own charm allowed Sean to get out of such a funny situation with dignity and cleverly met the girl he liked. She was a few years older than Sean, but this did not prevent them from maintaining a friendly relationship. The soul of the company often organized picnics where Mary Jane was invited. They walked a lot, visited parks and observation decks. The budding adolescent love affair was interrupted by the unfair reality of the adult world. The Eckert family received the sad news of the illness of Donna's elderly mother, Sean, and Stanley's grandmother. In search of prosperity, parents tried to take into account the interests of each member of the family. But the decision made fundamentally changes the life of the whole family. Sean did not want to leave his native land, his friends, and his Mary Jane. But the parents' decision had already been made. The Eckerts leave the city where their children were born and raised and move to another state. So in 2005, as fate would have it, the Eckert family settles in the house of Donna's mother in the small town of Spring Hill in Florida, where they begin a new life. The move was like a breath of fresh air for the whole family, because the decision was the right one. Sean and Stanley's grandmother was on the mend. Sean's heart was broken. He missed his band, in which he played, his walks with Mary Jane, and hangouts in his favorite city. But it is impossible for life-loving Sean to be sad for long. And after a while, a new life becomes as full as the one he missed. Donna and Samuel safely got a job at the Presbyterian church where they were almost all their time. Donna took care of the children in the nursery, and Samuel helped with the chapel. Over the course of time, the brothers grow close again and make new acquaintances together again at school. Old life seems to be resurrected in a new place. Sean plays in the school band again. Stanley attends a martial arts school that is only a couple blocks from their new home. Despite this new busy life, Sean can't stop thinking about Mary Jane. Every night after class, he locks himself in his room and they talk on the phone for hours. The goodbyes are in the same way, with Sean saying he dreams of meeting again. Each time he promises that after getting his parents' permission, he will definitely come to see her. Whereas the younger brother grew and kept his first love in his heart, the elder Stanley tried to establish himself in the family in his own way. Quiet and calm Stanley, by virtue of his stiffness and modesty, seemed to be deprived of parental warmth and attention. In pursuit of self-expression, he makes a series of bad decisions that will have dire consequences for the entire family. In May 2006, he informs his parents that he intends to drop out of school and devote his life to studying martial arts and creating a martial arts club. But youthful maximalism leads the guy into a bad company, where he begins to engage in petty fraud and try illegal drugs. In 2007, dysfunctional connections eventually led Stanley to arrest. He was caught stealing and charged with felony fraud-related offenses. The news of the elder son's shenanigans deals the first heavy blow to Donna. She ends up in the hospital with a heart attack. But the situation is quickly resolved with the help of a lawyer hired by Jennifer's sister. He skillfully defends Stanley, proving the lack of direct evidence, which allows the guy to quickly go free, receiving only a suspended sentence. This episode greatly frightens Stanley. He feels guilty and closes himself off in the hope of being understood and accepted by his family. Having survived the frightening events that happened to Stanley, Sean does not say anything to his parents about his decisions. During his summer vacation, he takes a job as a waiter. Having saved up some money, he leaves only a note for his mother to go to California to marry Jane. The long 2-day bus ride to his beloved seemed like an eternity. The scenery changed outside the window. The day changed to night, and Sean imagined how at the final station he would see her, his Mary Jane. The driver announced the final stop, and the bus stopped. Sean was ready to run to her, for he had already seen her happy face through the window and her long hair, which she was tucking behind her ears with her fingers. They had spent some of their happiest days together. They'd had picnics just like they'd had in his best high school days. Sean had confessed his love to Mary for the first time, and it was mutual. After another walk, the young people sat down on a bench. Sean felt faint. His eyes went black. He fell unconscious. Sean ended up in the hospital. The young boy was fading away like a match in a matter of days. Mary Jane contacted Sean's sister. Jennifer urgently flew to California. Doctors diagnosed the cause of such a rapid fading of a strong and sturdy guy. Tick-borne encephalitis begins suddenly and very quickly causes complications of various kinds up to inflammation of the brain. A difficult struggle for Sean's life and health began. Doctors fought for the boy's life for a long time. More than a month of coma and 6 months of rehabilitation helped him to return from the other side of the world. Sean had a very hard time recovering for a long time. An ordinary tick bite on a summer walk turned out to be a serious injury for him. Jennifer took her brother back to Florida, where he faced therapy and a long recovery. Mary Jane was left to wait. Again, the only source of communication for the lovers was the telephone. A series of troubles and unexpected illnesses brought the Eckert family together. Donna does everything impossible to completely rid her beloved son, Sean, from the consequences of a serious illness. She carefully monitors his diet and exercise. Such attentive care leads to a full recovery of Sean and to Stanley's inner resentment and jealousy, which he nurtures in bits and pieces. After a while, Sean regained his strength and returned to his studies in music. In 2009, he finishes his studies and dreams of going to his Mary Jane to return together and introduce her to his parents as his favorite. But Sean's plans are not destined to come true. Stanley introduces his brother to his dream girl, Samantha Rowe. Samantha, a native of Florida, quickly found a common language with the two brothers. Stanley was in love and sympathized with her, but the girl was impressed by the cheerful and sociable Sean. For some time, Stanley actively courts Samantha, and she accepts his signs of attention. Several romantic meetings end with a passionate kiss. Stanley is immensely happy, but Samantha, who said yes to her older brother, is still thinking about her younger brother. Samantha decides to write a message to Sean, in which she confesses her sympathy for him and invites him for a walk around the city. The guy agrees, and they spend the evening walking along the waterfront and talking about Stanley and Mary Jane. Sean does not seek to win the girl, after all. He has long belonged to another. A rejected Samantha writes a message to Stanley and tells him that Sean has been seeing her and confesses that he really likes her too. Stanley was furious. That same evening, he went up to his brother's room where they had a conversation. At first, the brothers talked quietly. Then their words turned into shouts. And then there was dead silence. The parents were at home, but the brothers sometimes clarified relations quite loudly. So they did not see anything special in what had happened. Mom was the first to realize Sean was missing. He hadn't returned her calls. Recalling the evening before, she got Stanley's explanation that Sean had left home after an argument. After 2 days of searching, the police received a frightening call. The caller was Sean's sister, Jennifer. The dispatcher who took the call heard only a woman scream in the receiver. A piercing male moan could be heard in the background. After repeated requests to calm down, the dispatcher finally records the request for help. Jennifer continues to scream. She pleads for help and reports, "Oh damn it, my brother Stanley killed Sean. He's in the house talking to his mother. His father is freaking lying over his dead son who's been buried in the ground since early Saturday morning. Damn it, I'm begging for help." Police officers arriving at the scene of the tragedy observed a horrifying scene. In the backyard of the house, Samuel was kneeling on his knees, 2 hands dripping earth. He was pulling his son's body out of the damp earth, screaming and trying to wipe the earth off Sean. In an instant, a quiet neighborhood filled with sculpted lawns, where the 2 young brothers often waved to neighbors, turned into the scene of a violent tragedy. And now the Eckert family, who once raised 2 sons, are left with the horrifying memory of digging in the ground only to find one of their sons and watching the other son being handcuffed and taken away. Stanley Eckert was detained on suspicion of premeditated murder. At his first interrogation, he revealed that he had no intention of killing his brother. In a moment of anger, he struck Sean on the head. The resulting injury caused Sean to fall. Stanley checked his pulse, realizing that his younger brother was dead. He tied up the body and carried it out the window to bury it on the lawn behind the house. Stanley's words at the inquest, "I buried him. After all, that's what you do with dead people." These words sound like the cold-blooded calculation of a serial killer, not a loving brother. In his defense, Stanley Eckert said he did it for his mother. He wanted to protect her from the shock she might have received at the news. Afterward, Stanley planned to move his brother's body to rebury it once his parents were gone. Stanley's behavior during the interrogation varied. He cried and confessed what he had done and was obviously sorry, presenting it as an accident, or he blamed Sean with hatred in his eyes. Stanley spoke very harshly and unpleasantly about his younger brother. He called him guilty for all his troubles, and admitted that he had won the rivalry for his mother's and Samantha's love. That same day, Stanley was charged with second-degree murder and taken into custody without bail. 2 days later, Dr. Barbara Wolf performed an autopsy on Sean's body. She presented to the court the results of the forensic examination, which indicated that the victim's neck showed bruising under the skin and rope marks were present, indicating that the neck had been compressed to make breathing difficult. The examination concluded that the death was the result of an inflicted head injury and asphyxiation. Assistant State Attorney Pete Magrino proceeded to scrutinize the case. On February 25, 2011, the first hearing began, presided over by District Judge Stephen Rushing. On the second row were Stanley's parents, Donna and Samuel Eckert. They wept as they watched their oldest son being led into the courtroom under escort. On April 9, 2013, the trial began in Hernado Court, presided over by District Judge Anthony Toddy. The defense was led by attorney Alan Hunter, while prosecutor Pete remained on the prosecution side. The main goal of the prosecution was to convince the jury that Stanley had carefully planned the crime. Defense attorney Allen stated that there was a spontaneous fight that led to the tragic outcome. In closing, Allen appealed to the jury to take note of Stanley's attempt to cover up the crime. In the name of good intentions, Stanley Eckert was charged with first-degree premeditated murder and faced a mandatory life sentence if convicted of that charge. Sentencing was scheduled for May 13th. Stanley's fate was in the hands of District Judge Anthony Toddy, who presided over the 5-day trial. Second-degree murder is punishable by up to life in prison. Stanley Elias Eckert always said he never intended to kill his brother 3 years ago before burying him in the front yard of the house. Before trial, Eckert rejected an offer from prosecutors to plead guilty to second-degree murder in exchange for limiting his prison sentence to 20 years. Eckert remained stone-faced as the clerk read the verdict. The brothers' parents, Samuel and Donna, wept quietly. As the jury left the courtroom, Samuel Eckert's sobs turned to screams, and numerous relatives gathered around Donna and Samuel. The jury agreed that Eckert did not plan to kill 19-year-old Sean, but the jury did not completely absolve him of guilt. After deliberating for about 2.5 hours, 9 women and 3 men found Eckert guilty of second-degree murder. All the while, the Eckerts said they believed Stanley's account of what happened in the early morning hours of June 19, 2010, and criticized the state attorney's office for filing the charges. Later Friday, Samuel Eckert said Chief Assistant Public Defender Alan Lanter did an excellent job. The family questioned the appropriateness of the sentence. They filed an appeal to appeal the verdict, but were denied. "I really can't understand how the jury reached a verdict of second-degree murder in about 2 hours," Samuel Eckert said. Despite that, our faith was not shaken, he said. One fact was not disputed during the trial. After his brother's death, Stanley pulled his body out of Sean's bedroom window and buried it in a shallow grave in the backyard of the family's Spring Hill home. Samuel Eckert found Sean's body 2 days later. Assistant State's Attorney, Pete Magrino, began his closing arguments at trial by showing jurors photos of Sean's dirt-covered body lying in a fetal position in the hole. This is not a detective novel case, Magrino said. He noted that Stanley, when questioned by detectives on the day his brother's body was found, changed his testimony as many as 6 times, saying he initially knew nothing about Sean's death. For 2 days after his brother's funeral, according to Magrino, Stanley sent messages from Sean's cell phone to family members saying that Sean had allegedly gone to California to stay with his girlfriend, Mary Jane. Also on behalf of Sean, he corresponded with Samantha saying that he did not want to communicate, and she should pay attention to Stanley. After hours of questioning, Stanley said that Sean had died during a struggle in the bedroom that morning. He claimed he heard a snap in his brother's neck as they fell to the floor. He then hid Sean's body to protect his mother, Donna, who has a weak heart. He said he planned to tell his father after his mother left on a trip. Those injuries that the defendant inflicted with his hands constitute murder, Magrino said. And he also called attention to testimony and Stanley's statements to detectives about rising tensions over Samantha Rowe. He also called attention to testimony about a conversation Stanley had with his brother and a friend about revenge in the weeks before Sean's death. In that conversation, the friend testified Stanley said that if he was going to kill someone, he would hit the person in the back of the head and bury the body in the yard. That evidence was tenuous at best and could not dispel reasonable doubt, Alan Lanter told the jury. A crime involves an act with an intended result, Lanter said. Yes, he was involved in his brother's death, but he didn't kill his brother. Lanter pointed to testimony from a forensic pathologist who said the blow to the head, combined with other factors, Sean's high blood alcohol content and possible lingering brain swelling due to encephalitis, likely led to his death. The pathologist also testified that hitting his head on the bedroom nightstand when the 2 men fell could have been enough to kill Sean. Lanter reminded the jury of the testimony of Donna Eckert, who said that Sean suffered from severe mood swings after suffering from encephalitis. At one point in her testimony, Donna Eckert called Sean's death an accident. The jury also could have found Stanley Eckert guilty of third-degree murder or manslaughter, calling the case a pardonable homicide. Lanter asked jurors not to let gruesome photos of Sean's body and Stanley's poor decision to bury him in the yard distract them from what led to his death. Stanley Eckert did something horrible after Sean died, said Lanter, but he's not a murderer. During the final sentencing, excitement gripped the Eckert parents. Judge Anthony imposed a sentence of 50 years in prison without parole. The parents were broken. One miserable day had taken 2 sons from them at once. The cold-blooded murder of an innocent man and even a brother is clearly beyond the bounds of adequate human response. In the biblical story, the brother-killer Cain was banished from paradise as punishment. But he solved the problem differently, eliminating the source of his remorse. Case of Brooke Skylar Richardson. In Ohio, the Richardson family, consisting of Kim, Scott, and their children Jackson and Skylar, seemed like a typical family. Skylar was a cheerleader who struggled with an eating disorder from a young age. Her mother Kim first noticed this when Skylar was 12 years old and refused to buy gum with more than 5 calories. As a flyer on the cheerleading squad, Skylar felt pressured to maintain a certain weight. This obsession with her body image led to a constant fear of gaining weight. During cheerleading season, Skylar started throwing up after meals to control her weight, which only made her issues worse. When the season ended, her struggles intensified. Skylar experienced episodes of binge eating, followed by periods of starvation or extreme dieting. Her parents grew concerned, but Skylar shut down whenever they tried to talk to her about it. They sought professional help from various doctors and therapists, who eventually diagnosed Skylar with body dysmorphia, a condition where she obsessively focused on a perceived flaw in her appearance. In July 2016, Skylar began dating a friend's cousin, but the relationship didn't last long. By January 2017, she had moved on to a new boyfriend, Brandon, and seemed genuinely happy and healthy. Her parents noticed her weight gain and thought her eating disorder was under control. In February, Skylar picked out her prom dress, a tightly fitted gown that required her to be laced into it. During a family vacation in mid-March, she wore a 2-piece bathing suit and looked wonderful. Her mom, Kim, wanted her to start taking birth control pills to protect her health. In mid-April 2017, Skylar visited her mother's gynecologist to obtain a prescription for birth control. However, during the visit, the doctor informed Skylar that she was approximately 8 months pregnant. Skylar requested the doctor not to tell anyone, and her mother remained unaware of the real reason behind her tears. Skylar and her boyfriend Brandon attended the prom on May 5th, despite her advanced pregnancy. 2 months later, on July 14, 2017, the police showed up at the Richardson home. They informed Skylar's parents, Kim and Scott, that they needed to speak to the teenager about something she may have witnessed. The police officers assured the parents that Skylar was not in trouble and took her at their word. Scott decided to drive Skylar to the police station, unsure of what awaited them. The police wanted to question Skylar regarding a call they received from a gynecologist's office. A patient of an OB/GYN doctor gave birth to a stillborn baby and buried it in their backyard. The police were informed and took Skylar, the patient, into custody for questioning. Her father was not allowed to be present during the initial interview. The police read Skylar her rights and shared the details of the doctor's report. According to the doctor, Skylar had discovered her pregnancy on April 26th, but later reported that the baby was not alive and had been buried in the backyard. Skylar admitted to the police that she had given birth to a stillborn baby girl on May 7, 2017. She explained that she delivered the baby in the bathroom, noticed it was not breathing, and had no heartbeat. Feeling the need to bury the baby, she retreated to the backyard, dug a shallow grave, and buried the body. To mark the spot, she placed a vase with a flower at the burial site. The police informed Skylar's parents, Kim and Scott, about the true reason for her detention. They were shocked to learn that Skylar had been pregnant, as they had no idea. They expressed sadness that Skylar had gone through this ordeal alone and without their support. Skylar revealed that she had named the baby Annabelle and claimed the father was a close friend's cousin, whom she briefly dated. Crime scene investigators searched the Richardson backyard, removing weeds and debris to uncover the baby's remains. Despite the challenges, they found several bones, including pieces of the skull, which they carefully collected and preserved. After more than 5 hours of questioning, Skylar and her parents were allowed to return home. However, 6 days later, the police contacted Skylar again, informing her that they had received new information from the coroner's office. They claimed that the baby's bones showed signs of burning, which Skylar vehemently denied. She insisted that she would never harm her child. Police suggested that Skylar might have tried to cremate the baby to hide the evidence, but she continued to deny any wrongdoing. However, Skylar suddenly changed her story, admitting that she may have used a lighter to try and cremate the baby's remains. She also stated that the baby might have been born alive and made a noise or even cried before dying. Skylar confessed to holding the newborn too tightly, which might have contributed to its death. During a lengthy interrogation, the police gathered enough evidence to arrest Skylar on a charge of reckless homicide. They believed she had suffocated her baby. After presenting the case to a grand jury, Skylar was indicted and arrested for aggravated murder, which carries a mandatory life sentence in Ohio. At her arraignment, Skylar pleaded not guilty to additional charges of voluntary manslaughter, abuse of a corpse, and endangering children. She spent the weekend in jail until her family secured a $50,000 bond. Skylar became the center of a media frenzy following her child's tragic death. The public judged and scrutinized every move she and her family made, taking a toll on their well-being. They retreated to the safety of their home, but even stepping outside became difficult due to threats and photographers. Despite her defense attorneys believing Skylar gave a false confession, the prosecution pressed forward with their case. Even when the medical examiner retracted her initial report of burning, the prosecution clung to Skylar's admission that she had attempted to cremate the remains. Throughout this period, Skylar's family endured immense stress and fear. The public scrutiny and threats made their lives unbearable, and they struggled to navigate a world under constant scrutiny. Skylar's defense attorneys worked tirelessly to defend her against the charges. Skylar's family raised the $50,000 bail, but as a condition of her release, she was ordered to wear an ankle bracelet. She remained confined to her home, avoiding public appearances. Over 12 months, Skylar's life took a different path. Her university plans were put on hold as she awaited trial for her baby's murder. The charges were serious, and the defense filed a motion to move the trial to a different county, but it was denied. Skylar faced the trial in the original jurisdiction, grappling with the emotional and psychological impact of the allegations and her isolation. Spending time with her dogs provided comfort and companionship as she awaited her trial. Her family stood by her, believing in her innocence and hoping the truth would come to light. Despite the challenges, Skylar remained determined to fight for her freedom. In July 2019, the state offered a plea deal. If Skylar pleaded guilty to the remaining charges, they would withdraw the aggravated murder charge. Skylar's parents were conflicted about the decision, but after careful consideration, Skylar turned down the plea deal. This decision terrified her parents, who wondered if she made the right choice. But they knew it was her decision, not theirs. Skylar went on trial on September 3, 2019 for the murder of her newborn baby girl. The prosecution presented as evidence a text message Skylar sent to her mother shortly after giving birth, saying she was happy and excited that her belly had returned to its normal size. They claimed this showed Skylar was relieved to be rid of her baby. The prosecution alleged that Skylar sent more texts to her mother and boyfriend within 24 hours of the baby's death, conveying her excitement and happiness. They pointed to phrases like, "I'm so excited and I feel so much better this morning," as proof of her guilt. The state believed Skylar was thrilled about the baby's death and attempted to hide her guilt. The prosecution also claimed Skylar had no intention of keeping her baby and presented evidence that she had searched online for ways to get rid of the baby. They alleged that Skylar's mother had threatened that her life would end if she became pregnant, which instilled fear in Skylar. On the third day of the trial, a doctor testified that the baby's death was a violent homicide, but admitted she couldn't determine when the baby's skull fractures occurred. The defense challenged the doctor's findings, suggesting she may have been biased. The defense also questioned the doctor's methods, pointing out that she didn't examine the remains under a microscope or consult with an obstetrician. Another doctor, a fetal medicine specialist, testified that it was unlikely the baby was stillborn, citing Skylar's admission that she felt the baby moving inside her. The prosecution's case included shocking evidence, including images of the deceased baby's remains, which visibly affected Skylar during the trial. Skylar's reaction to seeing pictures of her baby's remains was to stare straight ahead, avoiding eye contact. This stoic behavior contrasted with her emotional response the previous day when the judge entered the room. Skylar's defense attorneys argued that her life was far from perfect, even before the murder accusation. They claimed the prosecution's evidence was incomplete and misleading, and some texts were taken out of context. They emphasized that Skylar's frequent use of certain language did not prove she murdered her daughter. The defense highlighted Skylar's mental health struggles, particularly her long battle with an eating disorder. They presented evidence of her regular visits to a psychologist and nutritionist, along with pictures showing her varying weights and appearances. They argued that despite her physical state, Skylar tried to comfort and care for the lifeless body after giving birth. Skylar's attorney explained that she intended to tell her family about the pregnancy, but never had the chance. According to her doctor, she had 8 to 10 weeks before delivery and planned to attend prom and graduate before telling her mother, whom she knew would be unsupportive. An obstetrician testified that the baby was stillborn, and Skylar's description of the baby's appearance suggested it was not a healthy newborn. The doctor pointed out that Skylar only gained 15 pounds during pregnancy, possibly restricting the baby's development due to her eating disorder. The defense aimed to cast doubt on Skylar's statements to the police, suggesting she only told them what they wanted to hear. They argued that other factors may have contributed to the baby's death, and Skylar did not harm the baby. Skylar Richardson's trial lasted for 1 week, after which the jury deliberated for just 4 hours before returning a verdict. She was acquitted of aggravated murder, involuntary manslaughter, and child endangerment, but convicted of abuse of a corpse, a felony that carries a sentence of up to 1 year in prison. The judge ordered her to be held in jail until her sentencing hearing, which took place the next day. During the sentencing hearing, Skylar apologized for her actions and acknowledged the harm she had caused. The judge strongly admonished her for her role in the tragic loss of her baby, believing that if she had made better decisions during her pregnancy, her child would still be alive today. The judge sentenced her to 3 years probation for abuse of a corpse, emphasizing that her actions were morally reprehensible and illegal. In November 2020, a judge granted her request to terminate her probation 2 years early, acknowledging her progress and agreeing that she no longer required supervision. Since being acquitted, Skylar has taken advantage of her opportunity to demonstrate her rehabilitation. She has completed 2 semesters of college and has been working part-time at the law firm that represented her. Although she has faced challenges in finding employment due to her probationary status, Skylar remains determined to pursue her career goals. including attending law school and becoming a public defender.